Let's talk about what makes a rifle scope good or bad. I think the best way to start is to talk about optical performance, and that's basically how well the system reduces any distortions or aberrations. There's usually trade-offs. Basically, what we're looking for is an image that's uniformly clear and in focus. Um, it's hard to show, and I've had a hard time figuring out how to film it. What you're looking at right now is filmed on a Sony a7 IV through a 35 GM. I think the aperture's at f8. I've got it on a rig that allows me to align it. There's going to be some variability here, but this is the best way for me to show you so that you can judge for yourself. It was a cold, clear day, pretty sunny. When I think about optical performance, I think of clarity being the first and most important thing. Basically, how well a scope can resolve small details. We tend to see changes at magnification. The perception of clarity changes at magnification because as you get closer to those small details, you're more likely to pick up on the differences. But also optically, it's more challenging for the scope at that higher magnification. Clarity may not be uniform, center to edge. That's that spherical aberration you'll hear people talk about. Parallax, depth of field, more difficult to manage at higher magnification. So those are just some things to keep in mind. What you're looking at here is an NX8 versus a Collis on the right. The NX8 is at 32 power, the Collis is at 25, so that's that difference there, but I just thought that was an interesting comparison in the background here. So to start, I'm going to show you these three scopes. I've got them at complete opposite ends of the spectrum, not to compare the scopes themselves on their merits, but simply to give you a good demonstration because of how stark the contrast is. So we're going to zoom in on this eye chart here, which is a good way if you're looking for a cheap way to be able to compare things, but you don't really need anything like this. I just like anything that shows good contrast at 100 yards or so. So we're going to zoom in. You got the Arkin on the left, the tangent in the middle, and the Steiner on the right. If you aren't familiar, you're looking at about $500, $5,000, and then $1,500 in order. So it should give you a wide range to compare. What we're looking for here initially, and I'm going to freeze frame it here in a second, is just clarity, how well you're able to resolve the small details. And I will point out one part of the chart here in particular. You can start to see your ability to resolve the small details on the scopes on the left and the right becomes more difficult compared to the very clear tangent in the center. So this is just a demonstration of clarity. So when you sit down with two or more scopes, which is the best way to do this in my opinion, you're going to want to look for small details like this as a way to compare whatever you're looking at. Generally speaking, the more clear the better. The arrow now is pointing at what you should see to be purple fringing. This is a color aberration or chromatic aberration that manifests a lot in these high contrast situations. I'm also going to show you the green fringing that is, I would say, more present on the Steiner here to the right, kind of at the bottom of this eye chart. Basically, this is a scope's inability to focus all colors to one point. And it increases with magnification. So if you've seen my other videos on, say, the EOTech compact scope, it was really bad. High magnification short scopes, you tend to see more of that color aberration. And, you know, optical performance isn't everything, and there's a lot more to talk about there. You've got so many variables, but when I think about scopes, typically I'm looking for the best demonstration of clarity throughout the field of what you can see, and clarity that remains as you magnify to a greater degree, right? So right here you can see I've got the ZCO 525 here, and there's no chromatic aberration at all. Even at 25 power, the clarity from edge to center is extremely good. So that's showing very little or no spherical aberration. And there's a balance, right? So the shorter you build a scope and the wider your objective lens is, the more you're fighting that spherical aberration and other things. And so I think you have to compromise in most cases, one way or the other. So like the Collis 525i DLR here has pretty bad chromatic aberration compared to the ZCO, but it's also quite a bit shorter. So I'm sure that has an effect, and the field of view is larger. So there's trade-offs, right? So things to think about when you sit down and compare two scopes. You want to compare the images as best you can, apples to apples, right? So if you have a 5 to 25 and a 3 to 18, I like to set them to 12 powers, say somewhere that's kind of in the middle, but a power range where they're both going to be showing about the same image, so you can compare them. And so this, 5 to 25, when I sit it down with a Steiner 3 to 18, I like to get them, 8, 10, 12, 15 power, that middle range. That's the best for being able to compare them one to one. Generally speaking, you want the depth of field to be as forgiving as possible, and the parallax to be as forgiving as possible. The importance of that to you depends mostly on what you're using the scope for. The field of view is typically published. The important thing to think about with field of view when you're looking at published specs is they will say at max magnification at 100 yards, your depth of field or your field of view is this. And that can get confusing because max magnification on an 18 power scope is different than a 25 power scope. And so if you're just reading the numbers, you're going to think one is much better than the other, when in actuality they may be more similar than you think, because the max magnification is so different. And so it's important to me when I get them out is to set them to the same power. And if, depending on the way your reticle is set up, sometimes you can just read how wide the field of view is. But if you focus the scope on the same thing at the same magnification, you can look to the edges and pick up landmarks or points of interest that are different depending on the field of view. And I think field of view is very important if you're shooting any of the dynamic shooting sports. If you're doing something like F-class, I imagine it probably doesn't matter at all. Eyebox is another thing that's published but hard to put your finger on. And it's something that, in my experience, determining whether or not an eyebox is good or bad is based almost entirely around how it feels for me on the gun. The problem is, as you shoot more, narrow eyeboxes become less important. And for me, I'm having a harder time picking up on them because I'm getting comfortable getting behind the gun in any configuration. And so the way I'm judging now if an eyebox is good or bad, I mean, other than the published specs, is how well I can maintain my sight picture under recoil. If I tend to lose it pretty easily, to me that indicates it's probably, well, I either have terrible recoil control or I have a really narrow eyebox. That's something you can actually test at home by putting a light in front of your objective and then having like an index card or something behind your ocular, and you can set that up with a ruler and you can measure it. It's kind of a cool experiment, but there's plenty of videos on that, so I won't bore you with it. Overall build quality, this is subjective until it isn't. If you spend enough time on a scope, you'll get a good feel for whether or not it has good build quality based on whether or not it implodes at some point during a match or whatever. Otherwise, you just kind of have to feel it out for yourself. And I think, generally speaking, you can tell just by picking something up. And weight is not always an indicator of good build quality, but it often is. So let's have a look here. This is a Swamp Fox. And just in terms of build quality, you can see it's kind of got that shiny finish. But look at how this elevation turret wiggles, right? This to me would be a sign of inferior build quality. So this isn't quite as good. And you can see that on a lot of the lower end scopes, that sort of thing, where things are kind of moving on their own. Another thing that I look for, especially in cold environments, the lower end scopes tend to use O-rings, I think, and some kind of grease that makes it really hard to move these adjustments, especially when it gets cold, to the point where it can actually be a detriment on the clock trying to spin any of these controls, or if you're not wearing gloves or your hands are cold or whatever. That tends to be a sign that a scope is cheaper, especially in the cold. If I have a very difficult time turning these adjustments, this one's very hard, and it loosened up there a little bit, compared to, say, the tangent, right? In any environment, this is buttery smooth. Okay, so that's just one thing that you can look for. And then, related to build quality, you can talk about ergonomics and feature set. We have what I think is an example of the very best turrets you can buy, but this feels great to me. These feel great to me. It all just feels very good, very precise. And then let's say $300 scope here. This is a little bit cheaper. More muted sound. There's some slop between the adjustments. Okay. And importantly, hopefully you'll be able to see this. The adjustment, the indicator is now falling between the 10th marks. So I've spun it all the way up, and now I don't know if I'm on one number or the other because it's falling between them. That's very common in these less expensive scopes, is where you no longer fall directly on the adjustment that you're trying to make. Here's a example of a $1,200 optic. A different philosophy, I think, here in terms of the way this turret feels, but it feels much better. You can feel what you're paying for. And then let me pull up another very inexpensive scope here. Hard to even tell what's going on. Very loose, lots of slop. So those would be ergonomic, build quality type issues that I would look for as an indicator of whether or not a scope is very good. So all of this is to say, the best way to decide if a scope is good or bad is to get it in comparison to others. And then you want to be looking at the optical performance, you want to be looking at the clarity, you want to be looking at how well it resolves images without those color aberrations. You want to see how clear it looks from the center to the edge, from low magnification to high magnification. You want to be looking for pin cushion or barrel distortion, how flat the image looks, how much depth there appears in the image, how true the colors are to real life. You want to be looking at build quality as well as you can. You want to consider reputation, but make sure you think about things for yourself. You can feel how good the controls are, especially in really cold environments. Are they still easy to move? Does the pressure you have to apply to turn a knob, is that linear, or does it start really hard and get loose as it wears in? How old or new are the scopes, right? These are all things you want to consider, but it's best to do it with more than one in front of you. And that's how you start to build an idea in your mind of how well these things are constructed. You need to think about what features are available, what reticles are available. If you're leaning really heavily into the right-handed only controls, maybe a right side windage adjustment, center parallax adjustment is something that's important to you. If you're left-handed, maybe you want to reverse that. If you really like the Mill XT reticle, maybe you want to go with a Night Force scope, right? So there's a lot to consider, but the best way to decide for yourself is to get more than one in front of you. Sit down and compare them objectively and by the numbers. Look at the optics, look at the build quality, look at the features, look at the ergonomics. It's the only way to know for sure. Otherwise, you have to listen to schmucks like me. There's plenty of opinions out there, but you want to form your own, and always buy used.